Thank you so much for having us here again. It's always a joy and a delight to come and be with you for your Sunday service. Like I've been introduced, my name is Gaduku. I now go with Gaduku, though a number of young people would know me as Johnny. I have come with my wife, Maggie, and our last-born daughter, Joy. Our eldest and the middle one are attending the ropes program at church, so they couldn't join us here. And then I'm with a colleague called Stanley. Maybe he may be outside. We do have resources on the table as you get out. Media, you can project the presentation. So we do have resources at the very, I think there's a table outside, so you'll get an opportunity to have a look at what we do there. So we come from Timazi. Timazi is not an acronym. It is the Swahili word for plumb line, kafiro in one of our tribal languages. And it was inspired some 16 years ago as we have been serving among young people in the high schools, and we felt convicted that we needed a publication in this country that would preserve some of the truths we were proclaiming in different schools, because we would only probably preach in about 40 schools in a year. And then the generation of students would keep on changing. And at some point, we felt we are repeating ourselves to the new batch that comes into the schools. And sometimes they get a new speaker who comes on and who overturns some of the things that were said last week. And there was a lot of inconsistency in terms of what does a young person hear, and how can they be sure that what they are hearing, they can depend on it and hold on to it. So we came together with a number of teachers, and we decided to put together a resource where we will give a platform to the sound teachings in this country through different servants of God, and we will tackle one topic per issue. So it is a magazine by design, but a discipleship tool by content. And since that time, when we took it out to the schools, the response was overwhelming. We were scared, we were not publishers, so we learned how to actually do it. Today, we serve over 450 schools that now have a batch publications. We have done over 39 different topics. The latest topic we were handling was on when family hurts, which is an issue dealing with dysfunctionality of our homes and helping the child and the young person in school deal with the bitterness and the confusion about gender, the confusion about family relationships, and restoring hope for marriage for those in their teenage who are growing up in families that are not stable. And we have had the joy of interacting with your sons and daughters in the schools, and we are truly, truly grateful to God. And in the last few years now, we have started Eyeing Africa. We are actually the largest Christian teenagers magazine on the continent. And it's our goal and desire that God will upscale what we are doing currently to have opportunity to enter our neighboring nations in the south and in the west, that indeed they may also have a resource that is made by Africans, for Africans, with a biblical perspective. So that's our primary resource that we have, and you'll have an opportunity to sample them outside. But the other resource that we do is that 7 years back, we realized that our young people, we realized from our own experience first that literature played a big role in our spiritual formation. When I was a student at the university, I remember visiting Focus, and that was my first interaction with Dr. Wangombe. And I remember as I was brought in by the campus staff, I was introduced to the bookshop. And it is there that I picked up quite a number of books that were cheaply retailed, and that's how my own worldview and thinking about most of the issues of life was formed. And when I asked my wife, that exactly was her experience, that someone recommended very many books. And even when I joined the Trinity Fellowship, I remember we used to have Dr. Thuomboro, I would go to him to ask him a question, and then he would give me a book. And I would get annoyed and say, please answer my question. If you first read this book, and then after you have finished reading, let's come and talk. And mostly when I had finished the book, I would not go back to him because he knew that there was an answer in the book. And I learned how to dig out how my own spiritual formation. So we wanted to give the same to the high school students because what has happened is that in our country in the last 15 years, I think we have invested a lot in music. The amount of money that goes into music for the young people is in the millions. But in terms of literature, is in the hundreds. And therefore, as we are turning to the heart, I think we are not affecting the mind, and we are not engaging them in developing a biblical worldview. So for the last 7 years, we have been selecting a book internationally, and then we negotiate to get that book at a low price, almost at cost, provide that book to the schools that are subscribed to our publications, and then students will get an opportunity to buy the book with their own pocket money, read the book, do a book report, and that way they start developing a reading culture. So these are some of the titles, the ones that in the previous slide that we have done over the last 7 years. And currently the book that we are reading is called In Search of Sanity, the story of Begumisa Musinguzi, one of the top students in Uganda in the 2005 O-level. He was actually the top student, and his own struggle with mental health and how Christ helped him find sanity back, because I know that's part of what is being discussed in our culture. And then the other thing that we have now lately gotten into is from this year, we got the distributorship of the NLT Bible. And that's something we have prayed over the last 7 years. We have been praying and trusting God and fasting that we will get to a place whereby we can teach our young people to read through the Bible. And we can bequeath them the culture of learning how to interact with the scriptures. And so once we got hands into this text, our goal now for the next many years will be to launch a Bible reading program. And we are now partnering with a ministry that has been doing that for the adults. We now want to take that to the junior high school and the high schools, so that by the time a student is finishing up with the school, maybe the high school, they will have read the Bible from cover to cover and develop the discipline of being acquainted with the scriptures. And so we will, once that is ready, we will come back to you and invite you to give that as a resource to your young people here in your local church. Amen. Let me not talk about the other things that we do on account of time, so that we can spend the remaining part of this time you've shared with me to reflect on the battle for this generation. The topic for this morning is the battle for this generation. I'd like us to turn to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter number 10. And we are going to be looking at verse 8. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 8. Let us not commit sexual immorality as some of them did. And in a single day, 23,000 people died, fell dead. Verse 11 says, now, these things happened to them as examples, and they were written as a warning to us, on whom the ends of the ages have come. Now, that verse is pulled out from the Old Testament. And I would like us to go back to the Old Testament, because one of the best ways to interpret Old Testament narratives is to see how they are interpreted by the New Testament writers. What conclusions a New Testament writer picks up on or what angle they give it more or less helps us to interpret that story. He is saying that this story was written to be a warning to us who are living in the very end of the ages. How much more us who are living 2,000 years later after the New Testament has been written. So this text is picked up from Numbers 25. And so I would like us to turn now into the Old Testament to see the context of where that verse is picked out from. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time there to build up on my sermon this morning to us, the battle for this generation, and to see one single instance where we see the battle for a generation happening. In the Numbers 21, 22, 23, 24, 25 is like 4 chapters where we find the battle for a generation. And we are going to look at the character at the very center of that battle, and then we are going to draw lessons from his reactions and his thoughts, and then we are going to look at practical things we can do in line with how he responded. When you come to chapter number 21 in the book of Numbers, it begins by saying, when the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was coming on the Atharim road, he fought against Israel and captured some prisoners. Then Israel made a vow to the Lord, if you will deliver these people into our hands, we will completely destroy their cities. The Lord listened to Israel's request. The Canaanites were defeated, and Israel completely destroyed them and their cities, so they named the place Hormah. So in chapter number 21, it begins by showing the conquest, the military conquest of Israel. So Israel first destroys the Canaanites. Now when you go down there to verse number 22, it says this, when again they were confronted by another tribe, Israel sent messengers, verse number 21 of the same, 21, Numbers 21. Israel sent messengers to say to Sihon, king of the Amorites. Now they have already conquered the Canaanites. Now they have encountered the Amorites. And the Amorites are refusing them passage. It says this, that let us travel through your land. We won't go into the fields or vineyards. We won't drink any well water. We will travel the king's highway until we travel through your territory. But Sihon would not let Israel travel through his own territory. Instead, he gathered his whole army and went out to confront Israel in the wilderness. When he came to Jahaz, he fought against Israel. Israel struck him with a sword and took possession of his land from Arnon to the Jabbok, but only up to the Ammonite border because it was fortified. You carry on again, and they move up and they keep on moving, and again now they have destroyed the Amorites. So Israel is now starting to get fame of the fact that there is this nation who is conquering every other nation on its journey. So this is starting to spread out to the neighboring kingdoms, and it is starting to build up as a threat to all other kingdoms that were in the line of where they were heading. It says, now we again going up to verse number 33 of the same chapter. Then they turned and went up to the road to Bashan, and Og, king of Bashan, came out against them with the whole army to do battle at Edrei. But the Lord said to Moses, do not fear him, for I have handed him over to you along with the whole army and his land. Do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites who lived in Heshbon. So they struck him, his sons, and the whole army until no one was left, and they took possession of his land. Now, when you come to chapter number 22, the military conquests are now building. This is now becoming a mighty army that is becoming of repute wherever they are moving on. Verse number 11, Or maybe now, that's when now, chapter 22, now we get introduced to the king Balak. He says, the Israelites traveled on and camped in the plains of Moab, near the Jordan across Jericho. Now Balak, son of Zippor, saw that all Israel had done to the Amorites. Moab was terrified of the people because they were numerous, and Moab dreaded the Israelites. So the Moabites said to the elders of Midian, this horde will devour everything around us like an ox eats up the green plants in the field. Since Balak, son of Zippor, was Moab's king at that time, he sent messengers to Balaam, son of Beor at Pethor, which is by the Euphrates in the land of his people. Balak said to him, look, a people has come out of Egypt. They cover the surface of the land and are living right across from me. Please come and put a curse on these people for me, because they are more powerful than I am. I may be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land, for I know that those you bless are blessed and those you curse are cursed. The threat against Balak was not just hot air. He was terrified of Israelites. He knew, one, they had the tyranny of numbers and they had the military might. This now was a real threat to Balak, and Balak was not planning a counter in a war. He is the first king who responds differently, because now he acknowledges that I may not defeat this horde of people if I encounter them in an open battlefield. And so he changes his tact, and now he goes on to invite a prophet to bring a curse upon the nation of Israel. Now, allow me to first raise the first thing that I would like to bring to your attention. This weekend, among the young people, we are talking about holiness. We are referencing 1 Peter chapter number 1, looking at verse 15 and 16. And the reflection on it, as chapter 2 again in verse number 9 would say, that we are a holy nation, a peculiar people. And Balak comes to the place of acknowledging that indeed these people are a holy people. They have been set apart for God. And I would like to say this, that the enemy Satan knows it. The devil, our arch enemy, already knows that the church, the people of God, are already set apart by God. We belong to him. We are a holy people, a peculiar people, a holy nation, set apart for his glory and for his praise. And therefore, we do have a history of conquest against his own territory. And he knows that we are powerful if we function right, as we have been called to. And now he does something different. He goes ahead and looks for a prophet to bring a curse upon God's people. Now, on account of time, allow me not to read the entire of chapter number 22, because that would be quite lengthy for us. But in chapter number 22 has been, for many of us, the focus. Chapter 23 has been the focus. 22 and 23 has actually been the focus when we think about the story of Balaam. Because we think about the story of Balaam and focus on the donkey, isn't it? And the story of the donkey. And we learn about the story of the donkey when we were in Sunday school. But the story of the donkey is not as much referenced in the New Testament as the main focus of the drama. So that drama kind of distracts us for truly what is happening. This is actually a war that is raised. So after you have that drama with the donkey, comes now chapter number 24, and Balak gives up because Balaam refuses to curse Israel. And 3 times he makes the attempts, and 3 times Balaam blesses Israel. And at this time, Balak becomes so frustrated, extremely frustrated. And as if every other option was left and he knew now he is defeated, Balaam seemed to have removed something of an extra battlefield that maybe Balak was not thinking about. It is a strategy of war that when an enemy is too powerful for you, you turn into deception. When you know you cannot counter your enemy that is more powerful than you, you turn into deception. And this seems to be what Balaam sold out to Balak. And we know too well that when you turn into deception, you gain an upper hand if your enemy bows and is trapped in the deception, for you to indeed destroy them from within. And this is exactly what happened. Because chapter number 24 finishes by saying that Balaam then arose and went back to his homeland, and Balak also went his way, as if they gave up. But chapter number 25 reintroduces again the battlefield. In chapter number 25, he says, while Israel was staying in the acacia grove, the people began to have sexual relations with the women of Moab. The women invited them to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed in worship to their gods. So Israel aligned itself with Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against Israel. The Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and execute them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that his burning anger may be turned away from Israel. So Moses told the Israel judges, kill each of the people who are aligned themselves with Baal of Peor. And allow me to say this before we even read further, to now come to the very text that is referenced in the first, you remember we read 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 8. Before we now come where that is referenced, you realize that up until this point, the army of Israel has stood firm. They have conquered every other enemy in open war. Up until this time, they are an undefeated enemy. Up until this time, they are still wearing their pride as God's own people. But now in chapter number 25, there seems to have been quite a push coming in from Balak. There seems to be quite a push coming in and moving towards them relentlessly. And every time that now we have used looking at the weapon is that what Balaam uses in this very instance is not just a temptation at a personal level. Because for many of us in the church, we normally do interpret sexual immorality as a private sin. We interpret it as a private moral failure. But when you look at this text in chapter number 25, the writer of Numbers does not raise it, and even the interpretation we find it in the book of 1 Corinthians, this is not a private issue. This is not presented as a private issue. It is presented as part of the battle that has been raged against Israel for chapter number 21. So this then, therefore, sexual immorality and seduction becomes a strategy of spiritual warfare against God's own people, because it is the only means through which you infiltrate your enemy from within. And your enemy destroys themselves without you shooting a single arrow against them. So what was imagined and thought of as a private issue? And I'm going to show it to us this way. Because you see the reaction of God by releasing a plague upon his own people, the very people he has protected all this time, is to show that this was not a private issue. This is because they belonged to God. And when you look at the end goal of this game was not just so that they themselves would satisfy their own sexual cravings. The end game for this was that they would be turned over to idolatry. Because that is when God reacts. Because he says, these women now led them to worship their gods. So the end game of sexual immorality was not just in the personal, private failure of the one who has committed the sin, but it was in bringing about a spread of idolatry amongst God's people, coming in through sexual immorality of one single individual. Brothers and sisters, we are living in a time when Satan has raged against us with immorality. The extent through which we ourselves are being eaten from inside. Because as a young person, you may imagine that how I conduct myself sexually or with the opposite gender is my own private issue. And that's a first deception. To imagine that the choices you make and how you conduct yourself is a private issue. It is not a private issue. Because you belong to this army, because you belong to this community, because you belong to this body of Christ, because you belong to us, your immorality is in itself creating a loophole for the enemy for whatever cause we have united as a body. You are indeed bringing an infiltration of idolatry amongst us. You're creating a leak amongst God's people. You are being used by the kingdom of darkness. That which you are doing last night and that which you were doing last week by yourself in the dark of the night, imagining that's your own private life. Because you belong to us, it is no longer private. When you have an army out there going to fight with an enemy, their conduct sexually is not a private issue. If you are given a platoon to take out into the bushes and you're fighting with an enemy, the conduct of one army, one soldier out there sexually is no longer a civilian affair. Where you say, oh, those are your private issues, let's leave you behave the way you want. No, you are part of our army. And the enemy is using the women and is using sexual immorality as a seduction in which the soldiers are losing their ground and we are losing a battle right on our face. You and I know that as we have interacted with different of our friends over time, we have often been so dampened by the different stories that we would hear amongst us. And I come to plead with all of us, especially those who are young, and not just those who are young, even those who are married, that your own sexual purity before and after you're married is a matter of the kingdom. It is not just a private issue. It is a matter of the kingdom. Your compromise at a personal level, you're not just compromising for yourself as a personal level. The ripple effect it has on the church is so huge that you have no idea that that single incident that sounded as if it was just a small private issue, you have no idea. You have no idea what manner of spiritual warfare you're bringing to brothers and sisters who are risking their lives at the forefront of the enemy's gates to win one more soul. And how much you're compromising their own credibility at the very front line. And therefore, because you belong to us, and therefore because you belong to the household of faith, your life is no longer your own. Your conduct is actually not your own. You hold an accountability to us. We are in a war. We are in a battle. And when we look at the text, it references to us that indeed this was the leak through which this battle was won. When we carry on reading, it says this: an Israelite man came bringing a Midianite woman to his relatives in the sight of Moses and the whole Israelite community, while they were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. I'm reading verse number 6 of chapter number 25. Verse 7, when Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw this, he got up from the assembly, took a spear in his hand, followed the Israelite man into the tent, and drove it through both the Israelite man and the woman, through her belly. Then the plague on the Israelites was stopped. But those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. This was a sad day. 24,000 people is half or more of Kasarani Stadium. Those are not two people. And the plague was moving because they were in their hundreds of thousands as they were camped there. This was a sad day. They were already crying because of the plague that had come to them. And we find that deliverance actually did not even come from the leadership. As I move on now to my second reflection, where did deliverance come from this battle? Remember, Israel now is compromised. We have this young man who has gone ahead and he has brought in a woman into the tent in blatant impunity. You can imagine that the immorality had gotten to the extent where a young man could bring in a woman in the front of leadership, as leadership would look at them, and passes over and brings in immorality right into the camp. How did they become so audacious? At what point had this been tolerated until they became so bold as to conduct that level of immorality without hiding? How had they abetted such immorality for so long that the young among them were now becoming bold to do things that they ought to have done in the dark of night or in hiding away from their parents? How had it come so bad that they had become so bold? And in this action, it seems to have now created a new normal amongst the young people. And this new normal is that now they were no longer ashamed. And they could conduct their own immorality in broad daylight in front of their own leaders. But in this instant, we find that help did not actually come from leadership. Help seemed to have come from a young person. And this is in this single instance in the scriptures is an interesting reflection for us this morning. I was looking for, I think where I had already cited the identity of the young man, because the young man who had brought in both the young man and the girl, their parents were leaders in both of the tribes. The daughter who was being brought in was the daughter of the chief who was attacking them. It means that he was willing to give up his daughter to infiltrate on the side of the Israelites. So when you look at all this immorality, this is not just immorality at a personal level like I've said before. This was indeed a tool, a strategy of war. And they seem now to be presenting that. I think I lost my citation, quarreled in the wilderness to command, so where I had actually seen where they identify the identity of those who had actually come in. It's verse number? Verse 14. Oh, thank you, to verse 18. When the community quarreled in the wilderness of Zin, both you rebelled, it's because I've opened up in verse number 25. I think that's where I'm losing it. And I was wondering what's happening. The name of the slain Israelite man who was struck dead with a Midianite woman was Zimri, son of Salu, the leader of a Simeonite ancestral house. The name of the slain Midianite woman was Cosbi, the daughter of Zur, a tribal head of an ancestral house in Midian. Why would it care to actually mention the names and their lineage? It therefore almost meant that these were actually children of leaders. And when they are children of leaders, you don't want to speak loudly, isn't it? See, if the children of the leaders are the one misbehaving, what do? See, we talk in hush voices. If the children of the leaders misbehave, what do? You will say, oh, that's the son of so-and-so, so let's not talk too loudly. That's the daughter of so-and-so, let's not talk so loudly, let's talk in harsh voices. There is a bit of intimidation that comes with it. And we find that Phinehas, and I do not know how, he gains the courage and actually responds so violently. And at some point I thought, my goodness, that was really violent. He kills the man and the lady, and God seemed to have accepted that as a righteous action and actually stopped the plague. When I think about it, I ask myself, this young man, who taught him to be that bold? Where did he learn to be so angry? Because for a battle to be won for the generation, we will need angry young people with holy indignation, who will not accept the norm of sexual sin amongst us as a normal thing, that who will stand up against their own friends and say, this will not go on, this will not happen. And I think the single most quality that this young man had in fighting against his own generation as a battle, because this is a battle won by one person. Remember, this is not a battle that has been won with weapons. Well, he used a weapon, but it has not been in a vicious battle the way they would do military conquest. This is a single person who responds by standing alone. And by his standing, he saves a whole generation from extinction because God was ready to finish them. He actually does the battle for the generation. How did he fight that battle for his own generation? He stood up courageously amongst and against his own and said, no, this cannot go on. He had courage that was unusual. And that courage inspires me, even this morning when I think about our young people. Often out of my own 23 years of youth ministry, when we think about how do we fight the battle of a generation, often we think about how to invest in the masses of young people. And now I'm starting to get persuaded otherwise. That how battles for the young people, and especially the one that we are in right now, where we are actually having an onslaught of sexual immorality within the church, I am persuaded it will be won by a few young people that God has raised up for our own generation, like he always does in every generation. One of the books that turned me around in rethinking the strategy for ministry is that I used to get frustrated because of the many statistics that I would hear in the different places where I travel. Oh, young people are doing this. Oh, the young people of this day are like this. Oh, the young people of these days are like this. And there just seems to be a certain hopelessness that hangs as a cloud over us when we think about young people. When we think about the attendance to meetings like in youth groups. When we think about the excitement about God's word as a mass. It just dampens your heart, especially if you came from another generation that was more zealous than the current one. And the feeling is that we seem to be just flowing into some sense of hopelessness when we look at the masses of young people in every generation. But could it be that God will raise one or two in that generation, in their own mess, that God will raise one or two who will speak against amongst them. Not a voice coming from outside, but a voice amongst them who stands for the King and for the Lord. One of the books that I was telling you I read was Turning Children into Spiritual Champions by George Barna. It's one of the revolutionary books that have changed the way I think and about the strategy for ministry. And George Barna has been known for many years to provide research for the church. I think he's been doing that for over 40 years. In 2005, he wrote a document where he was changing Barna research into Barna Group. And one of the strategies he was applying into his new strategy, he said that for all the years he has been developing research, he now came to the conclusion, because he was pursuing transformational change in the church. He was saying, at first I was just satisfied to provide the research to the church leaders, and then the church leaders will see how to integrate and process that information and apply it to their ministries. But then he became frustrated and said they are not really pursuing true life transformation. They are happy to keep on with their programs. So he said, I am going to change my strategy. And so he began 4 different things. One of them was something called Josiah Corps. And in Josiah Corps, he said, after his research, he now realized that God calls a certain young people when they are still young. And if someone identifies those young people and pours out their life on them, they become the hope of that generation. And so he began Josiah Corps, where he had a strategy of investing 8 to 12 years into about 8-year-olds. He would identify when they are 12-year-olds, those who are hungering for God, and then he would pour out ministry strategy for the next 12 years. Allow me to suggest 2 things to us this morning, and then we are done. I should be finishing. Yes. I want to suggest 2 things. How do we raise Phinehas's? Because we need to change our paradigm and not get frustrated by the masses of young people. And ask God, how do we raise Phinehas's? And I'm at a loss because I can't draw that just from Phinehas. We just find how Phinehas responds. We're not able to see the background of how was he made to become the young man that he became and rose to fight the battle. But on my reflection and looking at the scriptures, it seems as if God, when God is angry about a certain generation, it seems as if God starts to raise another young person. God gives a promise that I'm going to raise someone else from among you. That is said of David. That is said of Josiah. We find that Paul does that with Timothy. They seem to go back and raise another person who becomes a fresh voice and a bold witness amongst a certain generation. In my experience of working with young people, I'm now persuaded that intensive, long-term residential programs are what produces the kind of Phinehas we are talking about. I know there are things we do for young people and for ourselves as youth for a short time, 1 week, 2 weeks, a weekend like we have had this time. But when I look back at young people who have indeed risen up as Phinehas's, I can almost trace residential programs that are intensive, that remove them from distractions, allowing them longer periods of prayer, longer periods of teachings, longer periods of personal reflection and silence. It's as if you have to first remove them from the culture. Give them a moment of being alone with God for a period of time where they really got to reflect deeply in the company of older people who are mature, and that after they are done, after that 1 year, you almost have a different kind of young person living that kind of a program. I want to present to us this morning I do not think the kind of onslaught that is against the church would be countered by short programs. I am not persuaded. Because as a young person, and you and I know, we are often distracted by these gadgets. I need to stay away from this gadget for a while, even to detoxify my mind. Even for me to concentrate for a period of time to hear God. And if there's a digital native among us, how will they hear God and they've grown up with these gadgets? They need to stay maybe for a week or 2 months without a phone. And they discovered God afresh. Some of them probably need to stay maybe for a week and fast for 3 days. Wrestling with God concerning their concern and their burden for their own generation. Let me mention to you a few programs. There's one program called the Foundation of Cross-Cultural Communication that is based in Malawi. One of our friends' daughters went there. When she came out, I think she really wanted to be an interior designer. And that program is so intense that early this year in January, a whole van of parents right here from Nairobi raised money, almost 150,000 for each child to drive their children to Chipata. No, it's not Chipata, it's called Chilo? To Lilongwe, where the camp is based, alongside the Lake Malawi. And because one of our friends' daughter went there, and by the time she came out, I think now she was thinking about the mission of God and what God would have her do with her own life. She had stayed long enough in the presence of God to remove the dross that would easily distract her from the noise of the culture. When I think about programs that have been organized by Operation Mobilizations, they have a camp in Zambia, they have a camp in Pretoria, and we were privileged to visit both of them. Here in this country, there's a program called HELD, Holistic, now I'm forgetting the acronym, what it stands for. I think Faith went through that. Faith, the lady, was standing here. And it is a 1 year. When that program was run, because the time we were experiencing it, all the students who graduate from that program became the leaders of the Christian unions in this country. Some of us will need to travel all the way to Chuka. There's a program there called Voice of Truth program. And the young people spend time there like 3 months. And in those 3 months, some of the convictions and the things they think about are really challenged, and they get time to pray. They get time to interact with one another. Could it be that probably even this local church would consider having such kind of a programs? And they are not exhaustive. Ourselves at Timazi, after many years of preaching in schools, we realized that we need to bring forth for this nation CU patrons who are well-grounded and who know the word. And yet we were not finding enough time to prepare them to become teachers in the schools. So we began a 2-year program where we work with education students while they are still on campus to actually tell them what God desires for this generation. And that was not even enough. We even needed to have a 1-year program where we stay with them in a residential program with an intense program where they have to do lots of reading, lots of praying, lots of conversations, lots of reflection on their own life. And I can see my brother here from Capro, Dr. Francis. And I believe they do have a program where you invite young people to come and spend time there and think deeply about what God would have them for their time and day and generation. Maybe it's time that maybe this local church thinks about. Would you give the young people in this local church an intensive program? The kind of onslaught I think we are facing as a generation is hard. It is hard. It is hard. We need to empathize. It is hard. Most of the young people are not getting into pornography because they were looking for it. It is because the pornography is looking for them. Sometimes they're just innocently browsing on the net doing their homework, and images just pop up and it begins a totally different journey for them, a struggle that they will actually fight for the rest of their lives. We need to have a robust engagement that would really help them not only to survive, but stand for the name of Jesus in their own generation in courage. But secondly, the second thing I would think about deeply is investment in literature. I cannot understate how much biographies have helped me evaluate what I'm doing with my own life. When I read the biography of Bruchko, of a young 19-year-old being called of God to go to the Okani Indians, when I read about Brother Andrew, right from that Focus bookshop, when I read about Hudson Taylor, all these books started challenging my own presumptions about my own life. And I was persuaded after years and years of devouring those different biographies, I started looking inward and asking God, what about me? If this is what you have done with other people in their generation, would it be that God, you would find me to use me in my own generation? But if I had never read those books, I probably would be looking at my friends and trying to chase what they are chasing and trying to catch up with where they are going, not even knowing there is a mandate and a calling that God would put upon my life. Brethren, allow me to close there and invite Reverend Wangwambe to come and pray with us as we reflect on those two different actions and asking, may the Lord help us to make bold decisions for a bold time. May the Lord help us to raise Phinehas's who will indeed save their own generation because they have been prepared well by this community. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen.